I followed the work that you guys have been doing with CSPI. And that's a really, really cool initiative. Like I follow Richard on Twitter, and he's also got a little bit of buzz around his latest article about, I don't remember exactly how he termed it, but essentially how institutions have a disproportionate political leaning sometimes.
Oh, yeah. This is sort of my area as well.
But did you guys work at all, or did he bounce any ideas off you for that piece?
Not really. He's very independent, and he's quite an original thinker.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll draw on, there's a bunch of us that are in a sort of network. We follow each other and we're doing sort of similarly heterodox things, but an interest in certain topics, an interest in data driven social science,
Yeah, it's a great team that you have. Like Zach Goldberg, who I follow his writings on tablet occasionally. And it's a really, it's funny, I sort of see CSPI and also the Heterodox Academy, like with Jonathan Haidt, as like sort of two real strong intellectual beacons of good political thought and like fair-mindedness, which is so missing today, unfortunately.
I know. It is remarkable when you look at the CSPI report, when you actually look at the sort of political composition of faculty and you see how skewed that is, and it's sort of become that way over time I'm convinced this has happened quite deliberately, but yeah, that just ideas about certain topics, certain points of view just can't sort of see the light of day in academia. So students won't be exposed to those in the university. They can be exposed to them online, but not in the university.
And how do you feel, or what would you advise someone who's sort of interested in doing a PhD? I was sort of on the fence about doing a PhD at one point. And again, I'm not I think I'd probably be considered a center, left, center, right individual, depending on my politics. But I guess on campus, you would probably be considered a decently conservative viewpoint if you sort of fall in that center point, just in some departments, I'd say.
Yes.
Is it a fruitful path for people who are sort of heterodox thinkers? Like I know there's obviously great thinkers like yourself and Jonathan Haidt who are in academia, but it seems like it's tough to get to that place of security.
Yeah, I think it's, what would I advise? So clearly, if you're interested in a particular subject, it's a good way to pursue that in depth, to do a PhD. However, if you want to do something controversial or where that has a clear political implications, you can be as far left as you want, and that's fine. You won't suffer a penalty. But once you move from this, even in some cases, even if you're in the center, but certainly if you move slightly right, then you're dead in the water as far as kind of getting an academic post.
Right.
It's going to be much, much more difficult. And we've kind of, you saw that in these surveys that we did where we asked people, they would openly admit, I wouldn't say, recommend this grant bid if it was right leaning, or this promotion application, or this journal article. And that's kind of giving you a sense of, there is a minority who are openly willing to discriminate, and all it takes when you have one person who has, say, if the average person has a 30% chance of discriminating, you put together 3 assessors, 4 assessors, by the time you've got to 4 assessors, you've got, almost a perfect chance that you're going to meet at least one person who opposes you. So essentially PhD, you'd have to be in the closet as far as your political views.
I have a friend who's doing a PhD at a Canadian university, and he formerly went to the University of Toronto for his undergraduate in the history department, which is a good department.
Yeah.
And he and I were drinking beer like right around the corner at a bar. And he was afraid of me like speaking too loudly or making jokes. And he told me to like whisper a little bit, because he was genuinely afraid that maybe some former acquaintance of his would overhear and he would sort of be in a very compromising situation. It was it's strange. Like it really is a very strange cultural climate that's going on right now. And your book, Whiteshift, which I loved, I just sort of read it cover to cover, sort of stands right on that fault line, I think, of really robust research, but also pushing the envelope in terms of bringing new ideas and advancing new ideas about white identity or as an ethnic group, and parsing that apart and looking at demographics and immigration. I think it's a really powerful book, which I think a lot of people should read.
Well, thanks, Ari. I mean, I would agree, of course, but I think, this is an example of where, this is kind of topic where you would find it very difficult to express certain positions which the data would be telling you, right? So if, for example, white identity is heavily correlated with having an ethnic identity, like Irish or Italian or whatever, the stronger you feel about being Irish, the stronger your white identity. It's not actually that radical a thing. It's a bit like the stronger your Cuban identity, the stronger your Hispanic identity, right? So it's the same for groups, whether they're white or non-white, and it's sort of an outer layer of identity. But that's an example of the kind of thing which should be just obvious knowledge. The data is so powerful that it shouldn't even be controversial in any way. But it's basically more or less unsayable that essentially white identity is because you hate people who look different. And
well, I think that ties into a very valuable concept, which you have spoken a lot about in the book, which is the Overton window, which a lot of people might not be familiar with, which is sort of like that comfort zone of legitimate and permissible speech, I guess, within society. And I'm not sure, maybe your thoughts on how academia maybe has shifted that Overton window, or how Trump, how you explained in the book, has shifted it maybe on immigration. But I think it really is a powerful concept, because when we're talking about immigration and identity politics, it's something which for some ethnic groups, it can be extended and seem as it's almost inherent. Everyone understands that there's a Jewish community, there's a Black community, but people don't really understand in terms of a white community or a communal consciousness in that sense. And I think that was a great part of the book that you highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, because there are certain ways. So you can say that, there's been large-scale intermarriage between Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and it's created this, Euro-American group. So Richard Alba, American sociologist, and he's a good liberal and everything. And so you can sort of approach it from one angle, and people will say, and a lot of people are just ticking Canadian or American on the census. And, you can see where that's happening. So that won't be too controversial, but once you start to sort of apply any kind of moral standard that isn't a condemnation to that real sociological phenomenon, which is just a reality, right? So, but then you are suddenly offside, right? So it's sort of, but this Overton window concept, that picks it up, where it's about the nature of taboos in our society, which are, in my view, actually not as recent as some people say. I mean, I think when I was going to Western in the late 80s, early 90s, that I think the same things which are taboo now were taboo then. And it's just that, that was the time when political correctness was emerging. But even if you were to go back to the 1960s, they were still the main taboos. You'd have to go before the 60s to actually find a climate where those were not the main taboos, and it was, homosexuality or being non-religious or whatever, that would have been a bigger. But I think that the culture, I think these things are kind of in the DNA of the dominant ideology, which emerges in that late 60s period. But as I write in the book, the taproots go back into the early 20th century, but then they really scale up in the 60s. And I think actually, what we've seen is more or less all about scale and not so much about new ideas. So all of the cancel culture and the narrowing of the window of acceptable debate is mainly driven by the fact that more people who graduated with this worldview, because there are more people going to university, more people in diversity offices, more equity and diversity statements and diversity training. All this sort of stuff ramps up, gets institutionalized, creates this climate, narrows the acceptable debate around the hot button issues, essentially race, gender, sexuality. I think those are the key three.
And you have an interesting vantage point, which is something that I didn't really think about, but how you go about looking at the American arena, the Canadian arena, and also Europe, and how sort of in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, you were saying how the discussions about immigration are very different than, for instance, Canada. I guess because you're sort of swimming in the water, you don't really realize sometimes the political climate of Canada, which maybe would be more analogous to sort of like in New York or California if you lived in the US. But how did that international vantage point allow you to look at this issue? Because I think it's a really fascinating sort of differentiation that you can see across these countries.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. I think, like, you can find in all these countries a a very narrow Overton window around immigration in certain realms. So, for example, in the Labour Party in Britain, you would find this a climate which isn't a million miles away from the climate in Canada in English Canada, not French Canada, but in English Canada around immigration.
Yeah.
And in the US, similarly, in the blue states, in almost every institution, you would find a similar climate to the climate that you find in Canadian politics. But in the Republican Party now, it's no longer the case that taboo holds. That taboo used to hold really, including in the media to a great extent, in the right-wing press, even in the right-wing media in the US, right up until 2015, that was actually a kind of taboo. It was, really not. Romney could talk about self-deport. He could talk about illegal immigration on the border, but he couldn't really make it the center of his political platform the way Trump did.
Right.
Once after Trump, then places like Fox News and the Republican Party have shifted. Now, I think there are real problems with Trump and with the Republican Party, so I'm not endorsing
Right, and that's one of the things which I find fascinating is that your book seems extremely measured in calling out bigoted and racist rhetoric, and yet it seemed like there was so much public outlash at the book itself, which I really struggled to understand, because from reading it, it seemed like there were tons of disclaimers and qualifications about statements which you were able to clearly delineate as like, this is something that's beyond the pale. This is the definition I would use for racism, and this is something that went beyond that. And yet there was still such a public outlash, or at least from some of the reviews I was reading, that really gave you a really difficult time, even after all these qualifications.
Well, yeah, because I think, for a certain kind of progressive mindset, if you aren't condemning the wall, for example. So what I said was, there's a big difference between insinuating that, Mexicans are rapists, and I know that's not exactly the words that he used, but essentially a loose generalization that would suggest that everyone coming across the border, is a bad person, a rapist, or whatever, which is, in my book, racism, from something, because it's directed against another group and generalizing in a sweeping way, from something like saying, we need a wall to help control illegal immigration, which lots of countries do.
Right.
It's pretty standard state behavior,
exactly.
And there's nothing racist about a wall. Even though it's also possible that somebody might have a racist motivation for wanting to put up a wall. That doesn't make the wall itself de facto a racist thing. And that's the kind of subtle difference that is very hard for people who have this very black and white broad brush view of the world, where you're either a good guy or you're a bad guy.
Right. Well, I found in the Jewish community, I think it's been a very interesting dilemma, especially with the Syrian refugee crisis. And I was speaking with a Holocaust survivor, Pinchas Guter, who's a pretty outspoken community activist and community organizer for March of the Living and stuff like that. And he's a big refugee resettlement activist. And I was saying, how do you sometimes balance the needs of refugees and migrants against sometimes the local communities, especially when they've done polling that shows that sometimes they don't hold the most liberal views towards Jews or homosexuals. And you can see European Jewish communities that are sort of in a difficult position right now. And like that nuance, I think sometimes is missing because of that Overton window that we're talking about, the constrained ability to, at least in North America, to sometimes have these conversations.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting with the, Jews. If you look at Jews in Britain, they're overwhelming. They're the strongest conservative party voting bloc, right? So they're overwhelmingly conservative. In the U.S., they're still, I think, the last figures I saw was not much more than 30% voting Republican. Now, obviously, with the ultra orthodox and other groups being Republican, that's going to change. But still, it's interesting that I think just the way the interaction between being Jewish and political party systems works in different places. Because, even before Corbyn, Jews were already heavily conservative in Britain. Right. And so I'm not 100% able to explain, like part of it is which region of the country they're in. But I'd be interested to see the numbers in Canada, actually.
It's more conservative leaning in Canada.
Are they more conservative? Yeah.
I think it definitely took an uptick with Stephen Harper. I think one of the mediating factors, which I don't know how it would cut across with different ethnic groups, but for the Jewish community, probably a very good correlation is intermarriage numbers. The more likely you are to be probably embedded in a Jewish community, the more likely you are to probably be close to Jewish identity and support Israel. And that usually sort of is a good crossroads between if you're going to vote more left or right leaning. And in Canada,
that's interesting.
yeah, we've been sort of more insulated from intermarriage pressures, I think, as much as the United States, maybe because we're a younger country immigration wise.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating. Yeah. Like, because they're tough debates, or at least they're nuanced debates in terms of weighing the interests of genuine migrants and refugees leaving and fleeing situations towards the incoming community. I think you did a lot of work on that, especially in the United Kingdom with the Brexit vote, especially with Eastern European communities, which I think was a very fascinating little side point over there.
Yeah, I mean, well, part of the point I was trying to make was that, there are two things. There's an issue about refugees, getting them to safety where they're housed and clothed and fed, and then there's permanent settlement. And I guess I break the two apart. That and I don't know, I did have, my grandfather escaped from Czechoslovakia, and so I'm certainly aware of the importance of having people be given a refuge. But I think it's another thing to say. So what I think we need to be doing is being as generous as any number of people should be allowed to be take refuge and be housed and fed and everything, get away from whatever genocidal thing is going on. But I think this second step of assuming permanent settlement, and to be naive about the kind of incentives that will then give to people to want to essentially claim asylum. Like if you look at the U.S. southern border, I just think these are, economic migrants, which is fine. And I'm totally I would be doing what they're doing. So I don't blame them at all. But I think realistically, the world is unfair. There are some wealthy countries. There are poor countries. And of course, people are going to try and get whatever route is open to them to the wealthy countries. But I think the better off countries, they are democracies. Their populations are willingly giving up half their income to pay tax for fellow citizens. There's a social contract there. You cannot just ride roughshod over democratic the will of the population. So there's got to be a control on the numbers that's in line with the.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the discussions across Western democracies or Western societies has shifted to a better place or to a worse place in the last 5 years? Or maybe, and what is your I know forecasting is obviously a very difficult business, but what is sort of that feeling towards? Is there encouraging signs? Are there very discouraging signs when you look out at the horizon?
Well, I think the populist rise post 2014 in Europe and to some extent in the U.S. has opened up the conversation on immigration numbers for centrist parties, particularly center-right parties, but also some center-left parties, such as those in Scandinavia, for example. And so I think that's to the good, that I think these things should be talked about openly. Like some people want faster change, some slower. That's one of the points in the book, is that we have to find an accommodation instead of saying the people who want slower change are deplorables and bigots, and you have to be in the group that wants only faster change, which is essentially the position of a lot of progressive opinion formers. And this is, academia would be a major place where you'd encounter that. It'd be very, very rare to find any academic supporting reduced immigration. And so that mindset, that black and white, very simple, simplistic kind of, essentially the world and opinion is complex. That's a way of trying to create moral simplicity and enforce it. So I think getting anything that gets us away from that is to the good.
Are there sorry to interrupt you, but are there any academics or people on campus that you really turn to and consult and see as a sharp researcher, someone who's doing good work? Because I know obviously there are a lot of sort of unsettling aspects of university today, but are there places, departments or schools or individuals that you look to as I would follow up on him and I would read what he's publishing?
Well, there would be individuals, and it depends on the topic. I think, my Matthew Goodwin, who's a friend of mine, and he writes some interesting things on populism. But you're right, on these contentious topics, it's very difficult in academia to publish. Arthur Sakamoto, looking at sort of sociology of race, for example, ethnic mobility, he's interesting. Orlando Patterson at Harvard. But so there are individuals out there who are interesting. But I think the climate on campus has been getting tougher. It was already bad and it's gotten worse. You can look at the number of attempts to cancel professors. That's jumped from sort of 15. It was sort of 10 to 15 in the last few years, according to the National Association of Scholars database on this, and it was 65 in 2020. So it's been this massive jump. And the no platformings, certainly in Britain from 2018 onwards, there was a big spike, and in the US, 2015. So yeah, it's essentially with this new ideology that people call wokeness, which is what I call left modernism, which is based on sacralization, making sacred historically marginalized race, gender, and sexuality groups. So if once you say these groups are sacred, they're out of bounds for anything that might offend even the most sensitive member of such a group is, or any criticism of a policy meant to help such groups, such as affirmative action or anything around indigenous studies or anything like this. Any criticism, you immediately are whatever, a racist, or you criticize Black Lives Matter, you're a racist, or you criticize, the trans debate. What's that?
I don't know if you've been following in Canada and Nova Scotia. There's a small university called Mount Allison, and there's a professor, Jordan Peterson, who retweeted it, but she had posted, I think, on a personal comments or blogs that she was sort of critical of some of the Black Lives Matter activism and systemic racism critiques and whatnot. And she has now been sort of, I think, I'm not sure fire is the proper word, but she's sort of living without pay right now. And she's not.
Yeah, I know that is remarkable. Just yesterday, so this in Britain I think this would be increasingly difficult for universities to do now in Britain but that's because Britain has a conservative government who has now gotten serious about this. So we've just had a bill go through yesterday, and a lot of the recommendations came from a report actually that I co-authored, a think tank report on academic freedom in the UK, and that's simply going to make it, any university that does that will immediately be hauled in and told to reverse it, unless they can show the person has violated, essentially broken the law, then they aren't going to be allowed to do stuff. So essentially what you need, I worry about Canada because the conservatives are relatively weak and the liberals and NDP are all generally pro-left modernism. So they would favor the emotional safety of historically marginalized groups as a higher value than freedom of speech, for example, or academic freedom. And therefore, because that's the dominant culture in Canada, you're going to get things like hate speech laws that are with hate defined quite expansively. Right. I would worry that academic freedom won't be protected, and even internet freedom will be only protected for certain. I just think there'll be an ideological bias in the way these things are enforced. So I don't see any real hope, given the electoral situation, to get a government in that's going to deal with that. Where you ultimately, it has to come from government. There's no way we're going to get the culture to change enough anytime soon, I would say, because the younger people are more intolerant now. And so, I just think, I worry that Canada's staring down the barrel of increasingly repressive speech climate.
And I think that ties into one of the research reports that you had put out recently, which I think was on either City Journal, and also it reminds me of the work done maybe a couple of years ago about the political tribes. I think it was popularized in the Atlantic, but it looked at the differences in views towards immigration, perceptions of racism between different groups, like within white liberal versus white conservative, black liberal versus black conservative. And it's amazing that in some ways, maybe because we viewed these groups as sacred, we sort of look at them monolithically. But in the sense that one of your data points, one of the executive summary data points, was that Black conservatives and I think white conservatives are more likely to not overstate the amount of police killings as opposed to traffic accidents that cause death to American Blacks, which I found a fascinating point sociologically, because it really talks about the rootedness or embeddedness of racial perception, basically, and how that impacts your view of society and current events.
Well, it shows, I think, quite clearly how having this particular ideology of left modernism warps your view of reality, right? So if you strongly, so if you, for example, believe that white Republicans are racist, if you agree with that statement, which is about 60 to 65% of liberal Americans, whether black or white, would agree with that. And So white liberals who agree with that, 7 out of 10 of them believe that more young African Americans are shot by police than die in car accidents. The real ratio is about 10 to 1 in favor of car accidents. But it kind of shows you how that belief system makes it impossible for you to get a factual question right, because you're going to be swayed by the media, by images, by anecdotes. And we all consciously select the anecdotes that confirm our bias. It's called confirmation bias in psychology. And the whole point of the scientific process is that you submit your confirmation biases to evaluation, empirical evaluation based on standards everyone agrees on, and you can be disproven. But of course, when you have orthodoxy, you're not allowed to raise those questions. And no, you couldn't. If you did an academic paper where you sort of pointed this out, it would be very, very difficult to get it published. Someone would find some reason why, the methodology wasn't quite right here or there, and you didn't dot this I. And so they would try and sort of not allow it to occur, to be published. So we're essentially getting a warped picture of a warped knowledge. Scientific knowledge is sort of distorted around any of the sacred totems.
And I guess the greatest question, or the most pressing question I have, and I sympathize with you, but why would you, obviously this is a research interest of yours, but why would anyone voluntarily subject themselves to this? Like, you can go about your way, you have tenure, you can live a comfortable life, like you don't have to get harassed or terrible emails. Like, why would the vast majority of people probably opt not to go down this research pathway? And was it just something which was sort of pulling you to explore more and deconstruct? Like, what was the motivation behind it?
Well, I think I did maybe subconsciously, I didn't even realize I was probably, I won't say self-censoring, but I was probably pursuing less contentious projects or phrasing things in less contentious ways to avoid, after a while you just see it as part of the furniture that you can't go to certain places, right? And then as you get older, you probably just say, what the hell, I've got, nothing to lose anymore. And also, you learn, at this point, probably it doesn't matter to me anymore that I don't get invited to certain places and that I can't socialize with certain people. And you just say it's more important to just tell the truth. And so that's more or less what I did. Although having said that, I mean, if you go back to even earlier things that I've done, there are some areas are clearly continuous. So this whole idea of left modernism and asymmetrical multiculturalism, whereby there's this view that sort of majority group ethnicity is a terrible thing, and you should try and slough it off and be cosmopolitan. Whereas if you have a minority ethnic group, you should actually be very parochial and cling to your tradition. So that contradiction is something I'd pointed out, as even in my PhD thesis. And so I already was willing to say something, but certainly sort of to say that, white identification and the desire to have limited immigration is sort of group self-interest could be understood in a framework that is the same framework that would lead, say, some Mexican Americans to want more immigration from Mexico. I mean, it's the same motivation, right? That kind of thing probably I wouldn't have said.
Right. And have you heard any critiques in the year or so or 2 years since the book has been released and since you started researching it, which made you contemplate maybe some of the major points that you had made in the book? Was there anything that you were like, okay, maybe I should pause and reflect on that? Or do you sort of feel that, broadly speaking, the emphasis of the book and the argument of the book still holds very strongly today?
I really don't think anything much has changed. So, for example, the argument that the rise of populism and polarization is essentially cultural and psychological rather than economic. I just haven't seen any evidence to strongly contest that. I mean, I have seen some evidence that would suggest there's small effects where you have a very deprived area, that might have some contextual effect on people's support for populism, particularly when we're talking about, let's say, populist parties, not something like Trump or Brexit, which are large-scale 45, 50% movements, but something where it might be the PVV in the Netherlands or UKIP, or something that's more at the level of, say, 10, 15%. Then I think you can see more of an effect on that. But certainly, for things like Trump and Brexit, no. I mean, this is almost entirely cultural and psychological. So I haven't seen any. And what I would say is that the COVID episode, that gets people thinking about their health, thinking about the weakness of the economy, all things that are not favorable, I think, to populism. As that fades away and you get immigration again, and you get people no longer just thinking about healthcare and the economy, then the kind of issues that favor right-wing populism in particular are going to be back. Mm-hmm. And I think you add to that the whole, in the U.S. with the crime wave around defund the police, and that's sort of that. Plus, you've got cancel culture, which is becoming a more and more important issue for more people. So that is now more of a debate, the whole free speech debate and tech censorship and all of that. I just think these cultural questions are going to be defining politics. I mean, in Britain, I don't know if you saw, there was we had local elections and a major by-election, which showed that, an area that hadn't voted for anything other than the Labour Party, the left-wing party, for 50 years or whatever, voted conservative by a margin of like 20 points, or I can't remember what the actual margin was, but it was all essentially, these people are not rich. They're it's a working class area, but culturally they're with the conservatives. And that's now what distinguishes the parties. So the Labour Party's class makeup is, if anything, more, white collar than the Conservative Party, which would have been just mind-blowing even in 1997,
Right, which I think is one of the fascinating points which you raise in the book, which is that's sort of the abandonment of white working class, or at least the integration of them into more conservative parties. I think especially like when you think of deindustrialization, death of despair, like Angus Deaton's research in the United States. And I guess similarly in the UK with Brexit, it seems to be the shift towards more cultural phenomenon that's sort of driving left-wing politics, or left modernism politics, as you would call it.
Yeah, I mean, you have two things going on. One is that the energy on the left is all coming out of this cultural left. Mm-hmm. So that turn of the left, which begins in the 60s, but is really taking off and now penetrating into the parties, the Democrats, the Labour Party, and the Social Democrats in Europe, that they have now, given that that's what they want to talk about, the environment and Palestine and trans and all of these issues. Their voters were still largely essentially interested in welfare and jobs and the material stuff. So there's been that kind of disconnect. And as they pushed down the sort of cultural route, a lot of those voters who were patriotic and were kind of in some ways traditional, they're not into defund the police. They're not into trans, that you can't discuss trans issues or else you're a trans. So, these sorts of things are quite foreign to them. And so they are now shifting away from these parties. And then meanwhile, of course, and of course, with the rise in immigration levels, particularly in Europe, that corresponds with more voters who are concerned about that issue switching to sort of right-leaning parties. Mm-hmm. Initially populist, but now more center-right parties that have adopted a lot of the populist, some of the populist positions on immigration, for example.
Right. My last question, and then I'll let you hook. Sorry for bothering you for so long, but
no, not at all.
And do you see, and I guess this is the one thing which I really took away from the book, was this idea of cultural production, intellectual production coming from universities, and sort of the absence of it on the conservative thought or the conservative spectrum. Are there any analogs to that today, or is that one of the reasons which just drives sort of the intellectual or cultural inequality? Like, you don't really, when you think of the animating issues of today, they're usually driven by the gender, race, sexuality kind of questions, the cultural turn in the 60s. And you don't really, at least not off the top of my head, think of conservative issues or a conservative consciousness in that sense.
Well, yeah. So the conservative intellectuals are mainly media and think tank, some academics, but it's more difficult, of course, for them to exist in academia. And there's only about, in the social sciences and humanities in North America, it's only about 5%, roughly, I would estimate, that are conservative. And so it's extremely small, right. First of all, and restricted. I mean, certainly, I think there are conservative intellectual currents. I mean, one of them is populism, this idea that no low taxes and democracy promotion is not really what defines conservatism, but actually conservatism is about some sort of preservation of tradition and social solidarity, and that would include usually some notion of nationhood, which is multi-generational, for example, and forms of nationhood, symbols of nationhood, which are multi-generational. That's important for social cohesion, and that So I think that this emphasis on the cultural, so both obviously free speech, but also some sort of defense of traditions, family, nationhood, etc. Not in an extreme way, not going back to the 1950s, but essentially saying that there was a lot of good in that, and we can't just degenerate into this scenario where history is nothing but a litany of racist and sexist crimes, and that we should be ashamed of, and only utopia in the future is what we can invest our hope in, which is sort of the way in which the kind of progressive narrative is going. I think there is resistance to all of that stuff, and I think that does represent a kind of intellectualism, but you're right that
it's not like at the surface. Like when I think about intellectual buzzwords like systemic racism, LGBTQIA, transphobic, like these things which are sort of, they've gained currency within, say, you can use them and express them. And I feel like maybe people struggle, or at least on some aspect of it, conservative intellectuals are struggling to break into that cultural conversation, at least amongst younger generations.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's quite divided in some ways. I mean, clearly certain words like free speech. Mm-hmm. If you throw certain words like free speech or reason, right?
Yeah.
Or authoritarian, that there is a resonance to a term like woke, which is referring to kind of progressive authoritarianism around these sacred values.
Right.
So there are some of those buzzwords, except I would say they exist in the online sphere rather than anything institutional. So they would exist with Sam Harris and Barry Weiss and people like that. But in publications on the right, like even National Review and City Journal and Claremont Review, and so there's quite a bit happening, I would say, media-wise, and also to some degree in think tanks more and more. Like I think Manhattan Institute's doing a lot. I think Policy Exchange, CSPI, all of which I'm involved with, are doing a fair bit in this area. But you're right. If you were to go to a university, you would be hard pressed to find this. You won't find Jordan Peterson studies going on at university.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. And maybe as a last question, do you have any future plans, any books that you can sort of drop, or hints you can drop as to what your plans for the future hold?
Yeah, well, I mean, just immediately, I mean, I've got a report I want to do on essentially cancel culture, looking again at a survey to see how broad it is, how big a political issue it is, and then I want to do a book where I'm really trying to sketch out what a post-woke future would be like, and where we say there is some merit to the idea of pursuing equality between race, gender, sexual groups, whatever. But we've gone too far. What might it mean to have a balanced approach where you take some of this on board, but not everything would be about exact proportional representation in everything, and so that's sort of thinking about what, because I think there's lots and lots of critiques and people like Douglas Murray and there've been a lot of people sort of pointing out all the problems, and maybe I've been among them with the wokeness and the sort of authoritarian nature of this. But what is our alternative? I think that is something that needs fleshing out in greater depth. So that's something I'm going to try to do, hopefully in less than 600 pages next time.
Amazing, Professor. Thank you so much for that. I don't want to take any more time of your day, but have a great one, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
All right. Bye-bye.